So I seen you over there studying, right? I seen you studying.
Well,
now,
no, I was just kind of comparing notes because, well, no, I mean, did just a little bit.
but I gave. Did you get the questions ahead of time?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good. Good girl. You did your homework. That's what I did.
But it pretty much matches.
Okay. Well, please, it's your time. So I never knew who Dr. Tom M. was, and I've been an NA member since I was 11 years old and an active member since 13 plus years ago, and I never knew who these people were. So there's a lot of people listening that like, who, what does that matter, right? Yeah. So it says, who was Dr. Tom M., and that's anonymity right there, and how did he get clean and stay clean?
Well, and I don't know a lot of this stuff either.
Okay.
Surprisingly, but we're learning together. But the good thing about this stuff is that it forces you to read and learn more. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
All right, sorry. So Dr. Tom, a physician who suffered from alcohol addiction, who later also developed a 12-year addiction to morphine, entered Lexington in 1939 and found a newly published book, Alcoholics Anonymous, which changed his life. Later that year, he had 3 other men held the first AA meeting in North Carolina.
Amen. Yeah, so Dr. Tom was in, actually, you would go to this place. There was 2 places in America, and picture this today, that there is a prison where people go to be prisoners sentenced by the judge, and then people that are prisoners to morphine or other drugs or opiates back in the day that weren't alcoholic, that didn't go to the sanitarium, they would voluntarily go to these 2 different places. There was one for just women and there was one for men. And they would voluntarily go to this institution in Lexington, Kentucky. And just coincidentally, right, just ironically, when this brother goes, it was the year that the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous came out. And he read it himself, and he started to pray and started to practice his program, and God touched him, took his desire to use, and he never used a substance again. But ironically, when he left, he went to North Carolina, and they actually wrote an article about it in the, what's it called? The Alcoholics Anonymous, the Grapevine. They wrote an article, and it's famous. Bill Wilson talks about one of the biggest success stories of the big book in Alcoholics Anonymous was this addict, morphine addict, that got clean, stayed clean, and started an AA meeting in North Carolina, which grew, and he was clean and sober the day he died. So that was Tom M. Who started, and he was intellectual. He was a doctor. Go figure, he surrendered. What started the first Addicts Anonymous meeting? Who started the first Addicts Anonymous meeting, and where was it? Where was this meeting held?
Houston S. suggests to Dr. Victor, medical director of Federal Narcotics Farm in Lexington, that an AA-type group be started for addicts.
Exactly. So they actually, like we in Narcotics Anonymous, they have a rich service history and in institutions, like all fellowships, but in NA it's even stronger. I know that's how I was touched. So they identified a need for similar experiences, utilizing the steps and principles of AA, but simply changing some of the verbiage to incorporate the word addiction or the word drug, right? That changed over a history of time in NA as well. And that meeting was successful. It was held at that farm in Lexington, Kentucky, all the way until the date of that institution closing down. And it was instrumental later on in where Jimmy K went to experience the atmosphere of recovery before he expanded NA to the West Coast, or God used him to. It says, who was Danny C? And Miguel P., we're going to talk about him. He said, you better talk about Danny C. He said, who was Danny C., and how did he get clean, and when did he start Narcotics Anonymous in New York City?
From the original Lexington detox, a man named Danny Carlson, who went through Lexington 9 times.
Woo! That's my kind of guy.
Oh, I was 13, so finally surrendered to the program and got clean. He went back to New York City and started something in late 1949 or thereabouts known as Narcotics Anonymous. So something I had on the side there that I will add, Danny C. was the founder of Narcotics Anonymous in New York City. He got clean. I had read that he got clean in the prison system. In the meeting was 1948. Mm-hmm. The first NA meeting held outside of the prison walls occurred in 1950 at the YMCA in New York City.
Okay.
And he also added the 13th step, which is quite interesting
Talk
because
about it.
most people think that the 13th step is like getting with a newcomer,
Right.
right? But that was not the 13th step. The NEC wrote the 13th step, which said clearly, God help me.
That sounds like affirmation to me. You know what I mean? I like that 13 step.
So the next time you hear somebody talk about the 13th step, right, you might want to say, help me, God.
So Danny C got clean through practice about what didn't work. I know that's
Pretty
my
much.
story. Yo, he got out. How many times did he get out? He got out 8 times. And on the 9th time, he ran out of ideas, right? And he said, I better carry this message and try to practice these principles and take it to the newcomer.
In all our affairs.
In all our affairs. You try, right? And, you know, when we start doing this service work, we forget how to obsess about that doing the other stuff. So, and Danny, he did relapse too, like several members, like Epi relapsed twice. So, I mean, it's part of this thing, but not everybody relapses. But Danny C, he actually incorporated Narcotics Anonymous as a nonprofit in New York City. So he was the official start of Narcotics Anonymous through him. It says, how was the need for Narcotics Anonymous identified inside and outside of Alcoholics Anonymous leading up to 1953? And there's a lot of stuff on this question, like in the grapevine and in the talks. Bill Wilson would talk about stuff going on, and then in NA we hear a lot about stuff that went on back in the day. And I don't know if it's all true, but I know as a newcomer I heard a lot of stuff about speculation, but I never really researched it.
So I like this question because it's a lot about identification, which is huge, right? Inside of AA, Bill Wilson wrote several articles in the grapevine acknowledging the drug problem in the fellowship. Addicts inside the AA fellowship were unable to express themselves freely within the program. Couldn't go in and say, I'm an addict named Cindy. I have a drug problem, right? The need for drug addicts to have a home fellowship for mutual identification and recovery was greater than ever. And I pretty much had the same thing, that there were members of AA who helped members start NA simply because of the identification.
There's so much in this question. How was the need for narcotics? It was identified. It was obvious, right? Because there was people in Alcoholics Anonymous that were using other substances besides alcohol, right? And they were using drugs, right? It's ironic to me these conversations still go on today. Alcohol and drugs are just a symptom of my problem. In both fellowships, it says I have an allergy. Once I pick up, I can't put it down. Divine intervention has to happen. But we'll still
Break
argue.
out handcuffs.
Yeah, we'll still argue about the symptom. Like, you know, this is like a conversation. But the beautiful thing is that Bill Wilson saw a great need he had a singular purpose for alcohol. That's what God gave him the 12 steps for, right? For drinkers back then. But what happened in society is drugs became a major problem. And then they were getting the same freedom, but they were getting excluded from this exclusive fellowship because of a symptom that wasn't their problem. Bill acknowledged it in the grapevine. You have a spiritual malady. You have a spiritual sickness. It's an inside problem. And he said there's a great need, and he could have said no. Danny C., and they could have came to Bill, and Bill could have said no. But since he was an agent of God, he copywritten information he gave to them and said, you can adapt it and put any words you want in there. Because they knew it was a great need. The 12 steps were needed for all people, right? All people. It says it in both fellowships, addicts and potential addicts. In AA, it says society at large. We want to help society at large. Both same message. So it says, where did Jimmy K get clean? And this is traditionally the man that is given credit in Narcotics Anonymous for the traditional, what we view as Narcotics Anonymous as a whole today. Where did Jimmy K get clean, and what led him to start Narcotics Anonymous in California?
By the time Kenyon and his wife Agnes moved to California in the early 1940s, his addiction had spiraled out of control. Desperate for a way out, he found himself at the doorsteps of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1950. It was there that Kenyon finally found the support and tools he needed to achieve lastly sobriety.
The tools. So God led him. God led him to the fellowship through word of mouth, through, hey, there was a solution to my problem. And by that time, you know, like it's a small network. I don't know about you guys, but I know everyone in Delaware that needs help or that are in recovery or that are walking this thing out. We're a small community in a big society. So I'd imagine back then, if you could picture back then in 1950 with the drug problem in our country, with the massive need, and there were some people that were actually getting up every day and not using and helping people. They say your name rings bells in the street. I bet you people knew who they were, and without cell phones, they could locate them. Like, they knew how to get that message, whether it was mail, snail mail, right? So,
and it goes on to say, I didn't see that second part there. He had communication with Danny C. in New York and visited the Addicts Anonymous meeting in Lexington, Kentucky. Bill Wilson gave permission for the 12 steps and 12 traditions to be adapted for Narcotics Anonymous. That's huge.
That's huge. But that's what goes on today, like society at large. Like, you ask the average bear out there that doesn't have someone in 12-step recovery, or an average family member that's not in Ar-Non or Al-Anon, right? They're not aware of the ties that bind us outside of individual fellowships. If you're in recovery and you have a solution, you're helping people. Like, even back then, it astonishes me that principles were bigger than personalities or ego. Like, people needed to be helped, and regardless, I'm sure there was a great resistance in AA for them. I'm sure some people were like, don't do that. But principle won out. The need won out, and God won out, and it was adapted. Of course, he went to see what was going on in the institution, the power in the institution. He had communication with Danny C. They were on the same page. Basically, he had fellowship on the issue. Like, he didn't do it by himself. He had God in the fellowship. It says, what caused the Narcotics Anonymous meeting in California, this is one of my favorite questions, to dwindle to one meeting in 1959? Catch this. AA exploded. NA did not have the traditions, right? Or they weren't really, in New York, they really didn't have them, and they didn't have them in California. They had them, but it kind of got away. But in AA, when they followed the steps, the traditions, and they were of service, the fellowship exploded, right? But in 1959, in California, it got down to one meeting with like 4 people. That's how close it came to extinction, and she'll tell you why.
In 1959, Narcotics Anonymous was affiliated with outside organization and not abiding the 12 traditions. Jimmy K helped prioritize the 12 traditions in the opening of all meetings, and I had that it dwindled due to strong personalities. Not practicing principles before personalities, but practicing personalities before principles. And that's why the traditions came before the steps. That's also at the time that the World Service Office was developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was powerful to do this research and to find out. And there's actually an audio tape of Jimmy K speaking about this and mentions the sister's name. She had like a year or two clean. But there was a gentleman, his name escapes me. He was allowing, picture this, here we are in 2024, and there's a lot of treatment, right? There's a lot of people profiting off us, right, that say they can help us. Back then, same exact thing in California. There was like psychiatrists, and they were buying the coffee, and they were and the spirit was removed from that place. It was removed because the altruistic value of one addict helping another without parallel, or one alcoholic helping another carrying the message through no profit or nothing to gain except spiritual growth herself, it was removed from these other motives, right? And the guy was exhausted. He goes to Jimmy K and he hands him the key to the church that it's still in California. He hands him the key and he goes, I'm going away for a while. Which means he wasn't going to help nobody anymore, because he was trying to help people on his own power. He was trying to help people what he thought was right. And he got wore out. And Jimmy K is on tape saying, we got to get back to the traditions. He didn't just say it. Who has ever been to an NA meeting and you're like, man, they got a lot of readings. They got a lot of readings, like 15 minutes of readings. Thank God for them readings I had to memorize before I left treatment, you know? And I go to a meeting and I'm like, oh, I know what they're going to talk about. They're going to talk about the path to freedom. And it would get on my last nerve hearing them traditions. But you know what? I know them traditions. Don't always follow them, but I know them, you know? Because he made them. He put them in the opening in every meeting, that they were to be read in every meeting, and they still are today for the newcomer.
You know how you learn them? You break them.
You break them? They don't
somebody will tell
problems.
you about it.
Right.
Yeah.
It said, what fundamental Narcotics Anonymous literature was published in 1962? I'm curious. You should know this. I should know it, too. In 1962, and what was added to this literature before it was republished in 1966, and what was added really influenced the next piece of literature.
The Little White Book.
That's right. That's right.
And the stories were added.
The stories were added. So the Little White Book, and I don't know, I think it came from Jimmy K and Fellowship, but the 10 chapters in the Little White Book mirror the 10 chapters later on in the basic text. And the stories continue to change and be added upon, but the stories were key for identification. We'll still have a newcomer read the stories and say, I say, who do you identify with in the back? Yeah. And they'll be like, what do you mean? I'm like, you got to read them. Yeah. That's what I started. I started in the pain, baby.
Started in the story.
It says, what did Jimmy K and Greg P publish in 1975, and what did it help shape in Narcotics Anonymous?
The writing of the basic text was a collective effort for...
Wrong question.
Oh.
Number 8.
All right. The NA tree, the service structure of Narcotics Anonymous, it shaped the service structure.
Yeah, and my sponsor, Chuck T, he had a huge, and I couldn't put it all on here because we don't have time. We want to respect everybody's time and not bore people, but, I mean, there's so much rich history in God working in every fellowship if you want to dig into it.
So let me add to that real quick. I had a side note. So Jimmy K published We Do Recover.
Talk about it.
Greg P published the IP pamphlet, which back then was public information. That's not called public information today. It's called public relations.
Right.
He also published The Triangle of Self-Obsession.
One of my favorites. Yeah, I mean, it's rich. I mean, these guys were in service. They were spirit-led, and God was just pouring into them. You can read this literature, you know, at the end of the meeting, when it reads Just for Today, you can, back in 1953, when Jimmy K writes Just for Today, there's like 3 words that are different. So all these years later, we're still reading what God gave them back then and still working. It said, how was the original basic text written? This will blow your mind. When it was published, when was it published, and how did it contribute to the worldwide growth of Narcotics Anonymous?
The writing of the basic text was a collective effort from 1979 to 1981 through member-on literature committees and conferences. The first publication of the basic text was in 1983. This book provided a consistent message of recovery and served as the primary piece of literature worldwide.
Still does.
So let me also add that the literature was written for addicts by addicts, right? Contributed through the Worldwide Service Office by translating into different languages, which Iran just recently received their literature in Narcotics Anonymous. And that is the only... Narcotics Anonymous is the only 12-step fellowship right now in Iran.
Wow.
And then another thing was that there were a group of addicts that got together, and what they did was they donated their own blood. Did you know that?
No.
Yes. So it was literally came from blood, sweat, and tears, right? And so before the basic text was published, a group of addicts got together, they donated their blood, and that is how they raised money to be able to publish the very first basic text.
Hey, that's self-sacrifice right there at its finest.
Yeah.
So it was definitely written for addicts, by addicts. And there, if you go on YouTube, there's a lot of information on the basic text. There's a lot of information on old timers, some of the original members. God laid it on a couple guys' hearts to push the issue. And then, like in any part of Narcotics Anonymous or recovery, they fellowshipped on it, and there was a need, so they committed on it. And I don't know about you, but I need the basic text. I mean, sometimes you try to read that AA Big Book, and if you're like me, it's hard to read anything coming in. But years later, I read it. But the basic text, if somebody relapses, I don't care what fellowship it is. You know where I stick them at? Book 1. Read that. Because if you don't understand the basic text, you might never get it. Because the basic text is simple and it's simplistic, you know, and you have to surrender. You read that. If you identify, you may not go back the other way. Don't go back that way. Come to us. So it says, when were the 12 concepts of Narcotics Anonymous service published, and how had Narcotics Anonymous grown into a worldwide resource for recovery from addiction by 1993? 93, how many years ago? What's that, 40 years ago? 30 years ago?
It was published in 1992. They published it to create more structure amongst the fellowship. So the traditions came before the steps, and then the concepts came because there still wasn't enough structure even with the traditions.
You help me, God.
By 1993, NA was in 60 countries and had 13,000 groups holding over 19,000 meetings.
Right. Yeah. And you don't want to know what the numbers are today. They're astounding.
You can't even count the numbers today.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a reason that we did AA, then NA. Thank you. Give it up for Cindy, please. She showed up. God brought her here, and he knew we were going to need her. So I'm glad she came.